For this project, we're going to be doing kind of a window out, and we're going to be talking about emphasis and composition, ways to make interesting composition, as well as some cool ways to do some watercolor techniques. So in order to prep for that, what we need to do is come up with a list of a couple of themes that you think you might be interested in doing for this project. So my themes I came up with are arts and crafts, animals, and nature, because those are all kind of things that interest me. I wouldn't do like sports because that's not something that interests me. If sports interest you, but you have no interest in arts and crafts, you would obviously do more sports than arts and crafts, just for example. After I make my list of like big ideas, big themes, I'm going to break that down into 3 or 4 things that represent that object for me. So for arts and crafts, I did paint palettes, brushes, yarn and clay needle, or yarn and knitting needles, and clay. So those are all things that represent that theme to me. Now it might be different for other people. Other people might have a list of completely different things, and that's okay. For this example, I'm going to use the arts and crafts example, so we can kind of ignore the rest of them, and I'm going to stick with things in this category. So I'm going to put this to the side. I'm going to get my piece of scrap paper. It's 9 inches by 12 inches. I'm going to take my ruler and line it up at the top, and then I'm going to put a little hash mark at 2 inches and at 10 inches. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the paper. I'm going to do 2 inches and 10 inches. I'm going to turn my ruler to the side, and I'm just going to connect the dots lightly. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing going this way on that line. I'm going to line it up. I'm going to do 2 inches, and instead of 10 inches, I'm going to do 7. It's going to be 2 inches and 7. And then I'm going to connect those dots as well. So I'm kind of creating a grid like you did last year. I don't have to go all the way up to the top. I'm just going to connect it in between the 2 lines. Okay, so we don't really need these lines. Those can be erased. We're going to worry mostly about what's going on in the center here. So some interesting things about composition, that our eyes are kind of trained to think certain things are more beautiful than other things. So our eyes are trained to think that compositions that are set up with the rule of thirds are much more attractive to our eyes than things that are centered right in the middle of the picture. So if you think about it, a photo where a person is jumping on the corner of the page is much more interesting than like your school pictures where you're just sitting straight in the middle of the picture. So the way that we kind of figure out the rule of thirds is we have our paper, and if you drew a grid over top of it in thirds, all of the interesting things would happen on these little points where the lines connect. And I'm going to put some pictures in the slideshow to show you some examples how this applies to real world pictures. And then the way we're going to do that in this project is we're going to take our paper and we're going to fold it roughly into thirds. I'm going to fold it here, and we're going to fold it here. So I wasn't exact, but that's okay. And we're going to open it back up, and then we're going to fold it in thirds this way. So that's creating a grid, but we're not drawing it. So it's kind of the fast and easy way to make a grid. So these little points right here, where those lines connect, one of these points is where our most interesting thing is going to be. So for my rule of thirds, we're also going to think about emphasis. We're going to use the rule of thirds to emphasize an element of something in our picture. So I'm going to pick something in my list, the thing that I think most represents my theme. So I think what most represents my theme in arts and crafts, I think a paint palette. That's the thing, when you're making a symbol for art, usually a paint palette is the thing that's going to do. So I'm going to pick one of these 4 points, and that's where the bulk of my paint palette is going to be. This thing that I'm going to draw, my paint palette, is going to be big, and it's going to break the frame. It's going to come outside of this box. So I'm going to go ahead and draw it in. Okay, paint palettes have these little holes. This doesn't have to be a perfect drawing, it's just a sketch. I've got some paint blobs. And what is a paint palette without a paint brush? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a paintbrush here. Again, just a sketch, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Now, the better you do on your sketch, the better you'll be at the end when you go to transfer it to good paper, but don't worry about it if your sketch isn't perfect. So that's that's the thing I'm emphasizing, the thing I want to be the part that everybody's eyes are drawn immediately to. So now I'm going to take the other things on my list and I'm just going to go ahead and fill them out. I really like knitting and I really like crocheting, so I'm going to draw, I think I'm going to draw down here a yarn ball. I'm going to have some yarn kind of coming off. So let's have a yarn string kind of coming and leading around. And I'm going to put some knitting needles in there. I'll make these come through. And then I teach clay. I love clay. You guys should all take that when you get into high school. So I'm going to include some clay stuff in here. I think maybe like a potter's wheel with a vase on it. So those are my main elements. So now I'm going to take the rest of my space and I'm going to maybe do some small things that deal with that. So I can think maybe some more paint brushes, maybe here this is on a table. So we're going to give it an environment. And, you know, people are working. I'm not breaking the frame with this one. I'm keeping this one inside of the frame. Maybe an easel. Maybe I'm going to put the easel over here with a little painting on it. And this one is going to be outside of the frame, so it's not going to go on the inside at all. You know, and anything else that you can think of that you might want to include in your picture. I don't have very many things in here. This is for your imagination. You can do things either on the outside or on the inside, or you can make them break the frame. Try to do a little bit of both. Try to have some things that break the frame, some things that are on the inside, and some things that are on the outside, and that'll make it much more interesting. When you're all finished with your sketch, you're going to show your teacher, and then you're going to get a piece of good paper. It's really thick watercolor paper is what you're going to get, and you're going to put it on top of this picture if you did a good enough job on your sketch. Then you're going to take it to the light box and trace it. When you trace it, don't trace these lines here. If you need to, you can erase those lines. And also if something goes through, so like this paint palette is in front of these lines, you don't want to draw these because these are no longer a part of your drawing. That was just our preliminary sketch, and that's why we do sketches on paper like this, not on our good paper, because then you can just leave stuff out if you need to. So go ahead and when you get finished with your sketch, transfer it to good paper and show your teacher, and you'll be set for the next step, which will be watercolor painting, and that'll be a different video. Alright, so by now you guys have transferred from your sketch to your good paper, and remember you didn't want to include those extra lines. And you also should have made your watercolor practice with all of the fun different ways to add color. So now, remember we talked about rule of thirds and emphasis. You're going to use the rule of thirds to draw the eye and create emphasis. Another way you're going to create emphasis is by making some things color and some things not. So the first thing you're going to do is take a Sharpie and you're going to trace all of your pictures, because we're not really looking for a realistic look here. We're looking more for an illustrative kind of look. So that's why we're going to trace everything in Sharpie, and then you're going to go in with your watercolor paint, and I want you to use at least 3 of these watercolor techniques somewhere in here. So the way you can use the color to emphasize is you can make only the stuff that's on the inside painted. You can make only this and some other select few things painted, or you can do the opposite and you can paint all of the stuff on the outside and not on the inside. And then something I didn't show you when you were doing the watercolor technique is a way that you can create white with watercolor. If you notice in your watercolor palette there's no white, that's because the white just won't show up. So typically you're just going to leave the area the color of the paper, but sometimes that can be a little hard, especially if you're doing these kind of techniques where it's wet on wet and it's just kind of going anywhere. So what you can do is you can take a white crayon. I'm going to do little reflections inside of my little paint blobs because they're wet, and you're just going to color with a white crayon. Press down hard so you make sure that it is solid all the way throughout. And now the thing is, you can't see it after you've done it. You just have to trust that it's there. And then you can take your watercolor paint and do whatever you were planning on doing in that area. So let's see here, what do I have going on? Okay, I'm going to maybe do this one blue. And you can paint right over top of the wax, and it won't matter because the wax does not like the water. So wax and water, they fight, and when they fight, wax always wins. And then if you wanted to, you could do your technique right over top of that too. So that's just an extra little tip there for you, and hopefully you guys can remember to emphasize one thing. So you're creating emphasis in this picture. Either color the inside, color the stuff on the outside, or just color the things that you chose on your list. When you're all finished, make sure you photograph it, load it to our Sonia, do the rubric, and then put it on the drying rack